The business of the afternoon, however, is to introduce Antonias, who has a background in classical medieval studies, but is concentrating his research now on fight books, as he describes them, which there are quite a few actually, including some famous ones. And he's going to be talking to us today about Joachim Meyer as a source of 16th century fencing terminology. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. And I would of course like to start by thanking the Society for inviting me to give this presentation. When contemplating on the exact title, I first considered talking about some of the topics I have already written and talked about elsewhere. But then instead of going the easy way, I settled on Joachim Meyer, one of the best known early German authors on fencing. I know from experience that fencing literature, or fight book literature, as I actually prefer to call it, is not that familiar to most audiences. So I will start by giving you some background information, which I hope you will find both intriguing and useful for understanding the context of Joachim Meyer. In German research, these books I talk about are known as Fechtbücher, which is sometimes contrasted with Ringbücher, works dealing exclusively with grappling. The English equivalent adopted in current research is fight book, which is fitting as no clear distinction between grappling and fencing is made in the sources themselves. And since my topic is fencing terminology, a kind of specialized technical language, I cannot entirely avoid discussing the details of the subject matter itself. I will do my best to supply you with all the prerequisite knowledge required to follow my reasoning, but if it happens that I fail to do so, I apologize in advance. Chronological order will give me the excuse to start from my ongoing research project with the title The Language and Genre of Royal Armouries Manuscript 133. It is, as the title suggests, a study distinctly philological in tone of generic features and linguistic peculiarities focalized through the oldest fencing manual in existence. This unique manuscript book is dated to the early 14th century and is made up of 32 parchment leaves, each depicting a priest and a student engaged in exchange of thrusts, cuts, and binds. In the theoretical segment, acting as a preface to the fencing sequences, the art of fencing is divided into 7 parts, which are the 5 possible starting positions of cuts and the thrust, and the so-called long point or Langort, the position of blade contact and generally the end position of all movements of the sword. The captions accompanying the illustrations are in Latin, but some technical terms such as Langort, Schildschlag, and Halbschild are given in German, with the occasional Stich alternating with the Latin Fixura. Within the captions, an instructional poem in the style of Alexander of Villedieu's Doctrinale is quoted, though composed in what could be called attempted hexameter. This poem is not known from other sources, but it seems clear that it should be considered an independent work of which we have only fragments left. From the Italian-speaking area, the work of Fiore dei Liberi, active around 1410, entitled Flors Duellatorum, or Duelist's Choice, is known in 2 recensions transmitted in 4 15th century manuscripts, one of which unfortunately has been lost sometime after its facsimile publication in 1902. 3 of the manuscripts are in Italian, 1 in Latin. The most famous name in the German-speaking area is that of Johannes Lichtenauer, who probably lived in the late 14th century. The earliest record of his teachings is preserved in a manuscript in the Germanisches Nationalmuseum in Nuremberg, dated on internal grounds to around 1389. Unfortunately, Lichtenauer composed his teachings in obscure poetic form. To illustrate this, I quote 3 examples. The first one is about the Zornhau, the wrath cut, one of the 5 so-called master cuts. Wer dir oberhauet, Zornhau ort ihm trauet, wird es gewahr, nimm oben ab anfahr. Who cuts from above, the Zornhau point threatens him. If he sees it, take it off above without danger. From the later glosses of Lichtenauer's teachings and illustrations by Paulus Kahl, we know that this means that if the opponent performs a high cut from his right shoulder, you need to throw a cut of your own, also from your right shoulder, and thrust at his face. If he manages to parry the thrust, you change the side with a move similar to a modern coupé. The previous example was rather transparent, but in the next one, we only have a list of 4 Läger, or 4 postures. 4 Läger allein davon halt und fleucht die gemein. Ochs flug allbert vom Tag, sieh dir nicht unmehr. Keep only 4 pastures and flee the common. Ox, flug, alba, vom Tag should be known to you. This is simply a list of, This is simply a list of the 4 guard positions, high and low, for thrusting and cutting, which I will return to later. As the third example, there is what amounts to an incomprehensible list of words. Vor und nach, die zwei Ding, sind alle Kunst ein Ursprung. Schwech und Stärk, indes das Wort damit merk. Luckily, we know from exegetic fencing literature that the words vor, nach, and indes refer to concepts of timing, namely to moving before, after, or simultaneously with the opponent, and Schwäche and Stärke refer to different leverage in the weak and strong parts of the blade, now known as foible and fort. Closely following Lichtenauer's tradition was Hans Lechtüchner, a priest from Nuremberg who edited or composed a version of Lichtenauer's verses with his own explanations detailing the use of a messer, a single-edged one-handed sword, the hilt of which is built like that of a knife. His massive work is extant in 2 autograph versions, one in Heidelberg, the other illustrated version in Munich, and some later copies. Lastly, at this point, I will mention Paulus Hector Meyer, a high-ranking civil servant of Augsburg. He was an avid collector of weapons and fighting manuals, and several extant manuscripts are known to have been owned by him, among them one of the most famous fight books, which had previously been used as a source material at Albrecht Dücher's workshop. More importantly, based on his collection and experimenting with fencing experts, he produced a massive 2-volume work, which we have in 3 editions, one in German, one in Latin, and one in both German and Latin. Unfortunately, to finance his hobbies, Paulus Hector used money from the treasury of the city of Augsburg and was hanged for this in December 1579. Using Paulus Hector Meyer as a source for historical combat studies is riddled with problems, but that would be the topic of another presentation. The earliest research on the fight book corpus has mainly been motivated by historical interest in judicial dueling, but in the 19th century, more attention was paid to vocabulary and language. The German terminology of 133 was noticed and discussed by such eminent philologists as Friedrich August Uckert and Hans Ferdinand Maßmann, and Karl Wassmannsdorf, the foremost expert on the subject in his time. Before these scholars, the earliest readers of 133, known by name, were active in the 16th century. The manuscript was taken from a Franconian monastery by one Johannes Herbert of Würzburg, who, having written his name on it, passed it on to his fencing student Friedrich Wilhelm, the Duke of Saxe-Weimar. He also showed it to his friend, a young Saxon nobleman named Heinrich von Günterode, who was so impressed by it that he decided to write a book entitled De Veris Principiis Artis Imicatoriae, on the true principles of the art of fencing. In the book, he talks about the mythical origins of fencing, the different kinds of fencing practiced in Germany, some technical details, and judicial matters. He quotes the instructional poem of 133, correcting some of its metrical flaws, and comes up with a noble interpretation as to its meaning. Günterode's book is preserved as an illustrated manuscript, the actual Liber Unus, but it was also published in print as an abridged edition without illustrations, titled Tractatus Brevis, Short Treatise. Both versions are dated 1579. In Günterode's time, however, there already was a number of printed fight books in existence. The earliest printed book of this genre, an obscure xylograph with a few wrestling moves, was printed around the turn of the century. André Paunfein's book on swordsmanship was printed in Vienna in 1516, later translated into French. Drawing from Pauenfeind and other sources, Christian Egenolf, and later his heirs, published a collection of various short fighting texts 4 times in Frankfurt between around 1530 and 1558. Around the same time, Fabian von Auerswald's book on wrestling was published in Wittenberg in 1539, with woodcuts from Lucas Cranach the Younger's workshop. In addition to the German books, several books were published in Italian in the 16th century. The best known are Opera Nova by Antonio Manciolino, published in 1531, Opera Nova by Achille Marozzo, published in 1536, and Trattato di Scienza d'Arme by the architect Camillo Agrippa, published in 1553, often cited as the beginning of modern fencing. I should also mention Giacomo di Grassi, whose book published in 1570 was translated into English in 1594 and was followed in England by Vincenzio Saviolo's book in 1595 and Paradoxes of Defense by George Silver in 1599, a proper Englishman who did not hide his contempt for Italians with their rapiers and thrusts. Heinrich von Günterode, however, occupies a special place in the history of fencing literature by being the first author to mention Joachim Meyer, the subject of my presentation. He says, Repertus est andannos aliquot argentinensis quidam Joachimus Meyer, qui conatus est firmas regulas demonstrare, et volumen etiam magnum hac ipsade arte edidit Germanico idiomate, et licet aliquid intellexisse videatur, usum tamen mistorum fundamentorum non commonstravit. Some years back, 9 years, there was a certain Joachim Meyer from Strasbourg who tried to demonstrate firm rules and even published a large volume on the art in the German language, and even though he seems to have understood something, he did not show the use of the fundamentals. Whether or not there is any truth behind this evaluation, we shall see. This conveniently brings us to Joachim Meyer. Meyer was possibly born in Basel in 1537. In 1560, he was married to Apollonia Rühlmann in Strasbourg, which enabled him to set up a cutlery shop there. During the 1560s, Meyer held multiple fencing competitions, and apparently people were so satisfied by his fencing instruction that he was encouraged to write a book on the topic, published in print in 1570. The costs of production made him look for a rich patron, and he did manage to acquire a contract to serve as the fencing master to Duke Johann Albrecht I of Mecklenburg-Schwerin. But the trip to his court in January 1571 proved detrimental to his health, and having arrived at Schwerin, he died on 24th of February 1571 in his mid-30s. The book Meyer left behind is divided into 5 parts, the first of which deals with the sword, the second with the dusak, a kind of one-handed saber popular at the time, the third part is about the rapier, the fourth part deals with the dagger, and the fifth part brings together the long weapons, namely the staff, the pike, and the halberd. The woodcuts form a corpus of positions and interactions, which are then referred to as needed. Not all moves described in the text are illustrated, and not all of the fighting pairs in the illustrations are evoked in the text. Meyer's book has been translated into English with extensive notes by Jeffrey Forgen, and a transcription of the original text has been published by VS Book, and a facsimile is available from Fines Mundi, both conveniently printed in horizontal quarto format. And as you can actually just pass around. Before the printed book, Meyer had also produced a manuscript for one of his students, Otto of Sonnewalde, which, thanks to the 30 Years' War, is now in the collection of Lund University Library in Sweden. The manuscript book deals only with the sword, the dusak, and the rapier. I said earlier that Meyer is one of the best-known German authors on the topic of early fencing. By this, I mean something more profound than simply having been mentioned in books on the history of fencing. Therefore, I will clarify this by saying something about the influence and reception of his work. First of all, his book was printed a second time in Augsburg in 1600. In 1612, Jakob Sutor composed a book which derives most of its illustrations from Meyer. Later, in 1679, Theodor Verolini published his own book, drawing from Sutor, or more likely, from Meyer directly. A faithful copy of Sutor's book was published by Johann Scheibel in Stuttgart in 1849, and if you look up any of the old fencing terms in Grimm's Wörterbuch, you are likely to find citations from this very book. In 1894, at a time when the survival of fencing as a sport was not as obvious as it is today, Josef Schmid-Kowatzig and Hans Kufal published a little book titled Fechtbüchlein. In their book, the authors devote a considerable amount of space to the history of fencing in Germany, quoting Joachim Meyer, discussing his system, and reproducing some of the illustrations from his book. Fechtbüchlein was even read by Oskari Väänänen, the author of the first fencing book in Finnish, published in 1923. First, if we disregard the military fencing manuals in Finnish that preceded it by several decades. And in 1935, a modified version of Meyer's two-handed sword was published to be used by the Hitlerjugend in Germany. That Meyer has been embraced as a source for matters pertaining to historical German fencing can be attributed to the availability of his book. But how should we evaluate the information he provides regarding fencing terminology? Before introducing individual cases, I would like to say something on this kind of specialized language in general. It is convenient to assume that, for example, the terminology of an emerging field begins as somewhat unstable, as the definitions of concepts and the usage of designations tend to become established only after some time. Even though the usage of various terms may become standardized, the resulting vocabulary will not necessarily be coherent in an etymological sense. To explain what I mean by this, I will use modern sports fencing as an example. Let us assume that 4 parries are taught during a beginner's course in foil fencing. Parries being moves that close the 4 possible lines of attack, that is, above and under the arm on the inside, and above and under the arm on the outside. The 4 parries are usually known by their French names as the sixth, the quart, the septime, and the octave. Now, a beginner might be tempted to ask that since the 4 parries are obviously numbered, why are they not simply numbered from 1 to 4? The reason is historical. The numbering is ultimately derived from the positions of the fist. If we use the right hand as an example, in the first position, the thumb is down, in the second, to the left, in the third, it is up, and in the fourth, it is to the right. This corresponds to the order of position the hand takes when the sword is pulled out of its scabbard, turned to point towards the opponent, and then rotated clockwise 1 quarter at a time, as beautifully illustrated in Camillo Agrippa's book, supposedly the first author to use numbers to denote guards. Later, the purpose of these positions changed so that the first position is used to close the low inside line, the second position to close the low outside line, the third position to close the high outside line, and the fourth to close the high inside line. These are the prime, second, tierce, and quart, numbered from 1 to 4, taught in both foil and saber fencing in Finland at the beginning of the last century, demonstrated here by Oskari Väinänen, the man whom I mentioned earlier. Because it is also possible to close all the lines with the nails pointing up, so to speak, we may add the sixth to close the upper outside line, the septime to close the lower inside line, and the octave to close the lower outside line, that is, 6th, the 7th, and the 8th. Using them and the quart, with the nails up, as the basic set results in the seemingly peculiar numbering scheme, 6, 4, 7, 8. This admittedly technical but still simplified example shows that terms that may seem illogical still originate from a historically coherent system, even though this might not be obvious anymore. As fencing terminology surely predates its earliest written record, it is not surprising that something like this can be seen in the earliest sources as well. To move along to the 16th century, my second example will show how this kind of development can be seen in Joachim Meyer's book. The earliest sources make the fundamental distinction between cuts from above and from below, the high cut and the low cut, in German Oberhau and Unterhau. It should be noted that the English terms are not exactly accurate, as a high cut is not necessarily aimed high, but simply proceeds downwards, whereas the low cut is performed upwards. Accordingly, between these two, we also encounter the horizontal cut, or Mittelhau. In addition, as I already mentioned, Lichtenauer's system defines 5 special master cuts, which are Zornhau, Krumpphau, Zwerchhau, Schielhau, and Scheidelhau. That is, wrath cut, crooked cut, thwart cut, squinting cut, and scalp cut. Even the names of the master cuts exhibit a mixture of different naming schemes predating the oldest literary sources, but for the following example, this is not relevant. In the second part of his book, Meyer defines 4 basic cutting lines for the Dusak, a kind of single-edged one-handed saber used for recreational fencing training. The lines go vertically downwards, diagonally downwards, horizontally from right to left, and diagonally upwards. The 4 cuts that are performed along the 4 lines have specific names, which are in order: Oberhau, or high cut, Zornhau, or wrath cut, Mittelhau, or middle cut, and Unterhau, or low cut. As can be seen, he uses quite straightforward names for the high, low, and middle cuts, but distinguishes between vertical and diagonal high cuts by naming the former Oberhau and the latter Zornhau, which clearly does not belong with the others considering its meaning or known history. As we can see, we need to be aware of the historical layers of the terms if we want to understand the state of the tradition at any given point. In addition, there are synchronic issues which need to be taken into account, such as multiple traditions contaminating each other. This brings me to Joachim Meyer's Mittelhut, or middle guard. But before we go any further, I will explain the concept of guard, or ward, as it is also called. In modern or classical fencing, the on-guard position is the neutral position from which one performs offensive and defensive movements and the associated footwork. In medieval and early modern German fencing, however, a guard is essentially a starting position for a cut or a thrust. For a high cut or a high thrust, one would start from a high position with either the edge or the point directed at the opponent. The same goes for low cuts and thrusts starting from a low guard. These are the 4 guards listed in Lichtenauer's verses I quoted earlier: Flug, Ochs vom Tag, and Alba. These correspond to Eber, Stier, Luginsland, and Bastei of the single-edged one-handed sword. On a side note, there is a functional distinction between postures that are mainly offensive and defensive, denoted by the Italian words posta and guardia, in German lega and hut, in Latin situs and custodia, and in English lying and ward. The distinction is, however, both explicitly and implicitly blurred in the sources and needs not concern us here. In a system that only distinguishes between a high cut and a low cut, an Oberhau and an Unterhau, a high guard and a low guard, or Oberhut and Unterhut, are enough. Maya adds other guards as well, such as the Zornhut, corresponding to the diagonal Zornhau, but what concerns us here is the middle guard, or Mittelhut, corresponding to the middle cut. Interestingly enough, Maya does not mention Mittelhut in the list of primary and secondary guards of the sword, even in his preface or in the chapter devoted to the guards. In the chapter on actually fighting from the various guards, however, he does have a section on the middle guard with 3 examples. This is apparently something of an afterthought, as he says that, quote, concerning this middle guard, you will be instructed later in the part about the Dusak, end quote, and that he originally did not intend to discuss it with the sword, but because the rows can be performed from it better than from any other guard, he could not avoid it. Confusingly, the cut he calls the rows is entirely missing in the chapter of the cuts of the sword, but it is of course discussed in connection with the Dusak. After the examples from the middle guard, he says that the rows can also be performed from the long point, and then he moves on to the other things he intended to discuss for the long point. In the second part of his book, he does indeed list the middle guard as the 5th basic guard of the Dusak. The other 4, incidentally, roughly correspond to the 4 guards of the single-handed sword I mentioned earlier, but Maya calls them Zornhut, Wechsel, Stier, and Eber. I will return to this later. In the chapter on fighting from the various guards of the Dusak, Maya states that the name of the middle guard, or Mittelhut, is derived from the associated middle cut, the Mittelhau. This fits exactly with what I said before, even though Maya's wording implies that it is the end position of the middle cut. And even the illustration shows it on the left side, not on the right, where a right-handed cut would start. And moreover, Maya lists 2 other cuts that specifically end in the middle guard. Be it as it may, the 5th part of the book on the staff, the halberd, and the pike is even more confusing. For the staff, Maya gives 5 guards, Oberhut, or high guard, Unterhut, or low guard, then Nebenhut and Mittelhut, or side guard and middle guard, in the same paragraph, and finally Steuerhut, or the rudder guard. Confusing languages. The first 2 are a simple case. In the high and low guards, the staff is held either pointing up or down, that is, high or low. The 5th one, of which there is a picture, has the butt pointing up and the tip pointing to the ground, but this guard is not important for the present discussion. What is interesting is that the side and middle guards are given in the same paragraph under a joint title. In the list preceding the descriptions, Maya specifically says that there are 5 guards, the high guard on both sides, the low guard on both sides, 2 side guards, and 1 middle guard, and finally the rudder guard. Unlike the high and the low guard, the side guard is, however, only described on one side, of which there is an illustration. Curiously, this illustration of the Nebenhut actually matches the Mittelhut, the middle guard of the Dusak, and confusingly, the side guard or Nebenhut of the sword, even though the latter is only described but not illustrated on the right side, and equated with the middle guard in actual use. What then is the Mittelhut, or middle guard of the staff? Maya simply says it is the straight parrying, or gerade Versatzung in front, from which one usually fights. Coupled with the intrusion of the middle guard in the title, this seems again like an afterthought. When Maya is describing fighting technique from the guards mentioned, there is a section titled Wie du aus der Mittelhut fechten sollt, or How you shall fight from the middle guard. Here he refers to the same illustration he had previously labeled the Nebenhut, but this time dubbing it Mittelhut. Later within the text he talks about performing the moves aus den Seitenlegern, from the side guards, introducing a wholly different German expression. After this section on the Nebenhut, Mittelhut, Seitenleger, he moves on to the gerade Versatzung, or straight parrying, which he earlier called the middle guard, illustrating it with an illustration that matches the gerade Versatzung of the Dusak. In the following section on the pike, Maya again explicitly equates Mittelhut with gerade Versatzung, being a position where the tip of the weapon is pointing at the opponent's face, situated between high and low. When he describes the Nebenhut or Wechsel for the pike, it matches the Nebenhut of the sword and the staff, with the explicit emphasis on it being on the side. As for the pike, we can find some corroborating evidence in Giacomo di Grassi, a contemporary of Meyer whom I mentioned earlier. I quote the 1594 English translation. There is another ward which would be framed as a mean between these two, that is the high and the low ward, and that is when the pike is borne directly towards the enemy, and so on. Interestingly, Di Grassi even calls this the straight ward, guardia retta in the Italian original, similar to Meyer's gerade Versatzung. To sum up, Meyer is using the same term Mittelhut or middle guard in two distinct senses. Firstly, in the sense of the position that goes with the middle cut, which fits well with some of the other guards and their associated cuts, and the ancient idea of a guard being the starting position of an attack. In this sense, Mittelhut is, for all intents and purposes, equivalent to Nebenhut, or the side guard, since a horizontal cut will start from the side. Secondly, he uses Mittelhut to refer to a guard that is between the high guard and the low guard, in the sense of not being high or low, but in the middle, pointing at the opponent. This he also refers to as the gerade Versatzung. In this sense, the middle guard is somewhat equivalent to the modern on-guard position. The weapon is in front, not committed to either side or height. It seems obvious that all the confusion arises from the clash of two terminologically not wholly compatible systems of teaching. This brings me to the rapier. The names of the guards in Meyer's rapier are fairly coherent. There is the Unterhut or low guard and Oberhut or the high guard. The low guard may be performed in front, on the left, or on the right. Interestingly, in the chapter on fighting from the guards, Meyer says that the low guard on the right is also known as Nebenhut or side guard. In addition, he notes that the Unterhut on the left is like the Wechsel of the Dusak. It is somewhat strange that only the Unterhut on the right should be called Nebenhut or side guard. In the staff, there were two side guards, one for each side. This does, however, match the usage in the sword, where he describes the side guard only for the right side. One could say that the old German system of using obscure terms such as Ochs and vom Tag is being replaced with more transparent terms like Oberhut zum Stich and Oberhut zum Streich in the rapier. Between the Oberhut and the Unterhut, Meyer does not have the Mittelhut or the gerade Versatzung, like in the staff and the pike, but instead a position he calls Eisenport. It should be mentioned that the rapier is something of a new weapon at this time, as well as the method of its use. Generally, before Meyer, a Versatzung, or a parry, is essentially a cut that intercepts that of the opponent and may even be performed preemptively, or vor. Meyer's gerade Versatzung, or straight parrying, even though he also calls it a Schnitt, or a slice, and explicitly says one moves into it from a high guard, seems to represent a transition to the idea of a single guard, from which one usually fights, as he says regarding the staff. As for the Dusak, he says that as a position, gerade Versatzung is the best of all because you can stand in it more securely than in any other and wait for your opponent. Same is implied for the Eisenport, the iron gate, since it is, according to Meyer, not only useful for defense against thrusts and cuts, but it can also be used to launch attacks. I should point out that calling something a gerade Versatzung, or straight parrying, implies that there is a Versatzung which is not gerade. There actually is, but Meyer calls it Bogen, the bow, just like Leckküchner before him. Interestingly, Leckküchner also talks about krumme Versatzung, a crooked parry, which seems to be the same thing, a parry with the fist in the first position, contrasted with straight parrying with the point up. Even here we can see manifestations of older vocabulary popping up in Meyer. Earlier I mentioned that Meyer uses the names Zornhut, Stier, Wechsel, and Eber as 4 of the 5 basic guards in the Dusak instead of Luginsland, Stier, Bastei, and Eber of the older tradition. In other words, he is using Wechsel instead of Bastei and Zornhut instead of Luginsland. Zornhut is the starting position of a diagonal high cut, so it can be seen as a more extreme version of Luginsland, or its equivalent vom Tag of the sword. In addition, Meyer does have a guard which acts as the starting position of a vertical high cut, which he calls Wacht, or the watch. His discussion of the name is interesting. Meyer explains that Wacht is synonymous with Oberhut, the high guard, because it is the starting position of an Oberhau, and explains the name Wacht as referring to keeping watch in this position until the opportunity to attack presents itself. This echoes the sense of a watchtower, which is the meaning of Luginsland. In Mayer's method of organization, Wacht is the starting point of a set of secondary guards. Moving straight down from Wacht, there is the Gerade Versatzung we saw earlier, then the Langort or long point, and finally Bastei or the bastion, which is not illustrated. When explaining Bastei, Mayer speculates that the masters of old probably used this name because here the lower part of the body serves the upper part, just like a bastion protects the city wall. Curiously enough, the examples he provides on fighting from Bastei are rather generic and could easily go under Wechsel. It seems obvious that he is including the term in his book for the sake of completeness, even though he himself does not seem to know what to actually make it about it. On a side note, unlike Stier and Eber, representing the horns and tusks of steers and boars, Luginsland and Bastei are derived from military architecture. Both these naming schemes, fortifications and animals, have been used of military formations as well, as exemplified by the Old Norse Skjaldborg and Svinfylki, literally shield, castle and swine formation. Hans Leckküchner has the word Bastein stand for all the four guards in his self-glossed poem. From the case of Bastei, it is clear that Mayer is engaging with an existing literary tradition. We know that he possessed a manuscript now in the collections of the University Library of Rostock, which includes, among others, glosses of Lichtenauer's verses. But did he also read printed books? In his chapter on footwork with the sword, he refers to the old fighters who were very experienced in all this, who in their 12 rules set down the following. Wer tritt erst nach den Heuen, darf sich seiner Kunst wenig freuen. Or, who only steps after the cuts may not enjoy his art much. According to Mayer, this means that a cut must have a step that is performed simultaneously with it, but what interests us here is the generic reference to die alten Fechter and their 12 rules. Similar lines may be found in the Rostock manuscript, where they are clearly ascribed to Johannes Lichtenauer. Moreover, in the accompanying commentary ascribed to Sigmund Einring, they are explained as teaching that one should not wait for his opponent's cuts. The same verse is explained again in the same fashion in another anonymous text contained in the same manuscript. Mayer's explanation and attribution, or lack thereof, differ from the manuscript he owned, but there is a list of 12 rules in André Paunfein's and, consequently, in Eggenolf's book I mentioned earlier. The rule cited by Mayer is the fourth of the 12 Lehren den angehenden Fechtern, but the printed versions have nicht freuen instead of wenig freuen. Interestingly enough, Mayer's rendition agrees with the second unascribed version in the Rostock manuscript, even though the reference to 12 rules clearly points to the version found in Eggenolf's book, who in turn had used Paunfein as his source. The formulation of the first half also agrees with the printed versions, even though Mayer has added the word erst. As it happens, Eggenolf's book also contains an abridged version of Hans Leckküchner's work on the single-edged one-handed sword called the Messer, but it is ascribed to a Hans Lebkommer of Nuremberg. This section includes a description of Leckküchner's Bastei. It seems likely that Mayer has taken the term out of Eggenolf's book, which would explain why he refers to the position as being named so by den Alten, as in Eggenolf's title, der alten Fechter gründliche Kunst, the thorough art of the fighters of old. I already mentioned that Bastei is equivalent to the Alba of the two-handed sword. In his description of Bastei for the Dusak, Mayer does indeed recognize this, saying that it should be used in a similar fashion by performing Absetzen and Abschneiden from it. For the sword, he does mention Abschneiden, but instead of Absetzen, he gives Schleudern. Absetzen of the sword, he says, should be performed from Wechsel. As I pointed out earlier, this is no wonder, as Wechsel and Alba or Bastei are, as positions, almost identical from a functional point of view. Therefore, there is no compelling reason for Mayer to include the word Bastei in his system of Dusak in the first place. This brings us to another discussion of etymology. Regarding the low guard Olba of the sword, Mayer says that he believes it comes from the word alba, meaning a fool or simple-minded, as no proper cut can be performed from it because one first has to recover from catching the opponent's cut, which would be foolish. This is, however, not what he suggests under the topics of Schleudern, Abschneiden, or even Absetzen performed from said position. Thus, his speculation on the meaning of the name of the guard cannot be reconciled with the teaching he gives regarding said guard. As for other interpretations of the name, we may have a look at the slightly earlier Latin edition of the Compendium of Fight Books produced by Paulus Hector Mayer. The term is translated in two different ways. In the illustrated section on the sword, the term corresponding to alba of the German version is habitus a similitudine pastorum quidum armenta pascunt fustibus innituntur, or posture that looks like that of the shepherds who, as the cattle are grazing, lean on their staffs. It can be argued that the position looks exactly like that. It still seems to be that this explanatory rendering was invented by the translator without consulting Paulus Hector or his expert friends. We need to distinguish two things here. One is that the translation avoids an opaque learned translation by using an explanatory phrase instead of simply providing the Latin equivalent. As a counterexample, in Paulus Hector Mayer's work, we also find that vier blößen, the four openings or lines of attack, are translated simply as quatuor nuditates, whereas Heinrich von Günterode prefers to render this as partes lesioni obnoxiae principales quatuor, four principal parts liable to attack. The other thing is whether or not this explanation conveys what alba is supposed to mean. Frankly, I do not see the connection between a shepherd leaning to a stick and the word alba. But to make matters more interesting, the title actually stands for both alba and vom Tag of the German original, and in the text it is actually used to translate vom Tag. This apparent combination of the two cannot be explained as a simple omission, since elsewhere a similar phrase is used to refer to a cut that starts from vom Tag and ends up in alba. As for the other occasion, in the Latin translation of a gloss of Lichtenauer's verse, alba is referred to as formaque dicitur Germanis populus, or the form which is called the poplar tree in German. This is tantamount to using a single matching Latin word and makes sense since this is a possible meaning of the German word alba. But we may ask if the image of a tree actually fits the position. In fact, this could be construed as a reference to the hanging seed pods of the poplar. So far, we have seen Meyer trying to explain a term he might have seen in Egenol's book and quoting a rule from Egenol's book, even though he seems to have learned a different wording himself, possibly through oral tradition. To add to the already frustrating confusion regarding the low and side guards, there is an instance where Meyer seems to be engaging in an argument with Egenol's book regarding one of them. As has already come up among the guards of the sword, Meyer lists Eisenport, or Iron Gate. He starts by stating that this is not the true Eisenport, which will be discussed in the section on the rapier. He goes on to explain that since thrusting with a sword is no longer used by the Germans, the true Iron Gate has fallen into disuse, even though it is used by the Italians and other nations. Therefore, he says, the inexperienced now call Eisenport what should be called the Schrankhut, or the barrier guard. In the Lund manuscript, he lists the Eisenport and Schrankhut as two of the 8 secondary guards of the sword, but does not discuss them further for the sword. Eisenport, or Eisenpforten, is given in Egenol's book as the third guard, also known as the Zwieg, or the thwart. The verse that follows seems to be a muddled version of Lichtenauer's verse on the Zwerchhau, one of the master cuts. In the following paragraph, the Iron Gate is described as being performed with the hands crossed, and the associated illustration in Paunfeit's original, here from the French translation, confirms its form. But is Meyer correct in condemning this usage? Egenol's text, of course, goes back to Paunfeit's 1516 book. What Achille Marozzo calls porta di ferro in his popular book does indeed match Meyer's view when it comes to porta di ferro stretta of rapier and buckler, or porta di ferro stretta and alta of the two-handed sword. But even his porta di ferro larga is more akin to Schrankhut, with a point pointing to the ground on the left, not depicted in his book for the rapier. The various attributes given to the Italian porta di ferro clearly indicate that the essential feature of the guard is not where the sword is pointing, or not even whether it is high or low. Going back to earlier sources, we find Fiore dei Liberi's tutta porta di ferro and porta di ferro mezzana, which both have the point to the ground. The earliest manuscript source in German, the Nuremberg Codex from around 1389, includes an instructional poem ascribed to Hanko Döpinge the priest, Andreas the Jew, Jost von der Neissen, and Niklas Preuss about the Iron Gate, von der Eisernen Pforten, which clearly says that the point should be to the ground. But what does Meyer see as the essential features of Eisenport and Schrankhut? For the former, it seems to be about being in front, like a gate blocking the attack. As for the Schrankhut, Meyer seems to imply that the name refers to the arms being crossed, geschränkt. This indeed does not occur in any of the low-pointing varieties of the two-handed porta di ferro, even though it does not really change the function much. though the exact technique of moves performed from the position will change dramatically. I would argue that Schrankhut should not be understood as crossed guard in the sense that the arms are crossed, but as Schranken, a barrier crossing the path of the opponent. This fits with the fact that the Schrankhut may be found described on both sides in an early 16th century manuscript source, and on the right side, the arms would obviously not be crossed. Incidentally, it is also described on both sides in the Rostock manuscript Meyer owned, but perhaps did not study that thoroughly. In addition to the rather technical issues, there are a couple of comments Meyer makes that are of almost purely linguistic interest. The first one is about the word winden. Winden, which refers to turning the sword to a position of advantage when in blade contact, is one of Lichtenauer's main points. Meyer says that auf gut Deutsch, or in proper German, it should be wenden, not winden. What Meyer is thinking of is probably that winden is intransitive and wenden transitive, in which case wenden makes more sense as it is the fencer who turns the sword. One could ask why he is not simply using the form wenden, but we may take it that he is commenting on existing usage without feeling the need to try to alter it. The second one is about indes, one of the three timing concepts and one of the keywords of Lichtenauer. Here Meyer refers to an apparently widespread belief that the German word indes is derived from the Latin word indus, referring to fencing inside, as results from winden. I have not seen this explanation elsewhere. Before I finish, I should provide you with what is known in Finnish as loppukevennys. If you think all these terms I have been discussing are ridiculous, you are in good company. In 1575, Johann Fischart, the German satirist and poet, published his free rendition of François Rabelais' Gargantua novels, now usually known by the short title of the second edition, Geschichtsklitterung. Suffice to say that in this rather strange book, written as stream of consciousness, there is a chapter where the character Tycho Gargantua visits places of fencing and takes part in various activities, learning, for example, den Zornhau, Krummhau, Schillehau, Scheitelhau, Wunderversatzung, Nachreißen, Überlauf, Durchwechsel, Hängen, Anbinden, Stich im Winden, Abschneiden, and so on. Most of this list could very well be from an actual fight book. Maßmann was of the opinion that the mishmash was undoubtedly from Meyer. More recent literature on Fischart is not any more enlightening on the issue, but I do not think there is any compelling reason to blame Meyer. To illustrate, here is another quote from Fischart, where the Tycho Gargantua braucht vor dem Mann Hildenbrandstreich, 7 Klafter in die Erd, braucht des Ecken Eckhau, des Laurins Zwergzug, Fassols Blindhau, den Ober- und Unterhau, Mittel- und Flügelhau, and so forth. Here we have a list of moves apparently inspired by German legends. Hildebrand's Strike, Eckhau of Ecke the Giant, and Zwergzug or Dwarf Pool of the Dwarf King Laurin, and Fassols Blindhau. The first one, Hildenbrandstreich, is reminiscent of an actual fencing term, something called Hildbrands, which does not occur in Meyer, but is found in Eggenolf's book. Blindhau is also a real term, incidentally found in Meyer, but not in Eggenolf, but its association with Fasolt the Giant remains obscure. Zwergzug is phonetically similar to Zwerchhau, the horizontal mastercut. In any case, Hildbrands seems to have triggered this list of made-up terms, poking fun at fencing terminology. There is further evidence that would point to Eggenolf rather than Meyer. At the end of the above list, there is a Flügelhau, which is not found in Meyer, but matches the Flügel in Eggenolf's book. In addition, at the end of the first list, there is a Türkischer Zug, also not found in Meyer, but again matching the Türkenzug in Eggenolf. But of course, there is no real reason to assume that Fischart was exclusively reading either Meyer or Eggenolf. I would argue that he is quoting none other than the master singer Hans Sachs, who wrote his Fechtspruch Ankunft und Freiheit der Kunst in 1545. In his poem, the speaker asks a master what he should learn first in the art. The first cuts are Oberhau, Unterhau, Mittelhau, and, surprisingly, the Flügelhau. These are mentioned in the exact same order by Fischart. This is shortly followed by a list of terms composed in poetic form far superior to that of Lichtenauer and closely matching Fischart's listing. Der Zornhau und Krummhau-Schau, Zwerchhau, Schillehau, Scheitelhau, Wunderversatzung und Nachreißen, Überlauf, Durchwechsel, eklig heißen, Schneiden, Hauen, Stich im Winden, Abschneiden, Hängen und Anbinden. Die Kunst hält in Vierläger klug, Albe Tag, Ochs und den Pflug. Of course, aesthetic considerations aside, pursuing comparison between Hans Sachs and Johann Fischart further is beyond the scope of this presentation. To conclude, I would like to point out two things. First of all, and quite obviously, Mayer's vocabulary cannot be appreciated without reference to and comparison with other existing sources. What we see in Mayer is the outcome of centuries of changing fencing culture, resulting in a mixture of various models of naming things. Secondly, said mixture was not even in a stable state even in Mayer's head, as he was constantly teaching other people, writing about the art, and ostensibly reading. What we have seen is a snapshot of his learning process, manifested in his comments and confusion regarding the various terms. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Are there any questions first of all, or comments? I think I'm still trying to get my head around all the information and technicalities. Can I just ask, my dim recollection of the, I'll just call them fencing books for the moment, in Elizabethan England, or one of them I suppose is not strictly fencing, seem to represent very much a conflict between schools of sword play. Do you find the same, Maya? And his contemporaries and near contemporaries?
Well,
Saviola represents something new in England, doesn't he?
Yeah, and there is this famous thing with George Silver and exactly. Saviola, of course. Exactly. Yeah. Well, there isn't anything quite similar because he's not really talking bad about anybody, and he's kind of embracing the rapier and taking it into his system, and kind of gives the impression that Germans. Well, he's a German. But Germans are the ones who have forgotten the art of thrusting because it's too dangerous. And yes, he actually says that it's no longer done in kind of recreational sports fencing because of its inherent dangers. But the Italians still do this. So they have a kind of better system than the Germans in a way, more complete or more authentic. So he's kind of the opposite of George Silver in this sense, you could say. He's actually embracing thrusting.
Yeah, and I think Silver and Saviola were actually teaching in London.
They're of course, there is the physical.
Quite almost quite literal conflict between their systems.
Yeah, and of course there, like I said, he had these Fechtschulen, these fencing competitions in the 1560s. But as far as I know, there isn't anything else known about them that he kind of applied for permission to have them. But we don't know what was actually happening there, because this is also a topic that sometimes comes up with when you have these different guilds, the Maxbrüder and the Federfechter, and they kind of, the Federfechter are the better lot. They are engaged in kind of better handicrafts than these other people. So there is this kind of competition between two different fencing groups, but there is no way of knowing kind of how Meyer personally feels about all this. So of course there is a conflict that's inherent in fencing, and just look at different fencing schools today. I mean, it goes on.
Further questions?
Well, kind of more of a historical question, actually. 16th century.
Yeah.
How real was this? I mean, to what extent did they actually use this? I mean, nowadays it's obviously sport. But back then, I mean, this is a bit kind of beyond the scope, but.
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. I'll just show quickly one illustration. I dare not to press anything else. Well, this one. Well, actually, that one as well. You can kind of see the sword type which is used. It's got this wide ricasso, and it's actually flat. So these are sports weapons that we see depicted here. They are not like real swords, and the context of their usage is basically in these Fechtschulen. So this sword is learned for fun, you could say. And the same kind of goes for this previous one, where we see them training with the daggers. They are also depicted with training weapons. You can see this ball at the point and so forth. But then there is this one. That's an actual bladed weapon. And the technique that's associated with this pair actually goes as far as saying that if you're kind of attacked in the street and somebody grabs a knife, then you can do something like that. So there is this, use for self-defense, which might happen if you are carrying a rapier around and somebody tries to rob you or kill you for whatever reason. Then you might pull the rapier first and start doing things. And Meyer actually mentions this as well for the rapier, that you start by pulling out the rapier. Mm-hmm. He doesn't describe the technique, that's for later authors to do, but he mentions that. So there is this context where you still have your sword not ready for use, but you have to take it out. But this is not a topic of discussion for the other weapons, really. And even there was a picture of a pike somewhere, and pike, of course, is a military weapon up to the early 18th century, where it's kind of superseded by the bayonet. But the kind of pike use Meyer has, like grabbing with one hand and doing fancy moves, it's not really kind of military pike use again. So there is this active group of people who use these weapons, engage in competitions. And I would say that's kind of real use, of course. It's like nowadays, of course, when people study fencing, it's not like for any real use. But then you could say that the real situation of fencing is the competition. Yeah. And Oskar Riväänänen, whom I mentioned, he actually, when he published his book in Finnish in 1923, he still kind of says stuff like that he's chosen the Italian school of Hiebfechten, cut saber fencing, because it includes thrusting, and the swords of our officers are also suitable for thrusting. So he's kind of bringing this to a very, or attempting to bring it to a practical use. The Finnish officer swords were not really meant for this kind of use. But so it might be, it could be said that this is something of a trope in fencing literature, that they try to make it relevant as well, that they kind of like Lektyshner's the other manuscript ends, there is this letter to his patron, or the dedicatee of his fencing book, where he's kind of trying to say that yes, it's important for you to know this stuff, it's good for princes and stuff. So obviously they are not, it's not that obvious that this is something you should really know, but it needs to be sold. Even at these earliest sources we have. But yeah, of course, military use is it's kind of its own world. Yeah.
Would there have been like a set of texts related to like military?
These appear in the 17th century, and they are actually kind of good in the sense that they bring in their illustrations are far superior to anything you see in these. They really give you, like in this famous book on drill, which is used, I think, by every reenactor group who does the 30 Years' War, where you see all the close order drills with the pike and the musket and so forth. So they actually show you like exactly how things are done. But when it comes to like using swords for fighting, it's like I was just reading the first Finnish military manual from 1685, which actually says that kind of that you draw the sword and then you just attack. So that's the only instruction given for you. It's kind of assumed that you know how to use it in some way. And in the military, it's not like one-on-one fighting, but it's like you move these guys fresh against these guys who are afraid, and then they just push them back. So it's not really about individual fighting. And just I would like to mention that this is also something that happens in 20th century Finnish close quarter combat manuals, where they constantly refer to the use of the knife, but they never talk about it until 1990. So it's referred to and said that yes, even the first Finnish book from kind of 1917, it says that in a tight spot you can pull your knife out of your boot and stick it in somebody's throat. But that's about as far as they go.
Christian? Okay, just mainly an observation. One of Silver's main arguments is that these wishy-washy Italians teach how to look good. When you are trying to impress people, but his system works for real.
Yeah. This.
But as for Meyer, it's nice to see how he's neither the starting point nor the end point, but rather, as you say, a snapshot. Somewhere where you can see that there are traces of quite a long tradition that have been replaced in terms of terminology. So that his rapier terms are more modern than his longsword ones.
Yeah, that's exactly.
Yes, I would like to pick up the idea of looking good, because usually what happens in this kind of arts, or if we think about riding, first it was functional, it was used in war, then the same movements were made for sort of aesthetic purposes in art riding in the 16th and 18th century France and Italy, and then became sports. And so the same applies, same logic seems to apply to fencing when it was sort of taken out from the real context of combat. But has there been ever, earlier in the history, so a period where it was maybe, or even a side thing, seen as an aesthetic thing, as something, as a sort of choreography that you do beautiful movements and have a beautiful technique?
Fencing in general.
Yes.
Well, yeah, that's kind of what then happens to a very large extent in the starting from the 17th century, coming to the 18th century, when it's kind of like the nobility is no longer really associated with being able to wage war. It's like when you think of knights, their function starts from being the heavy cavalry, and they need to be able to fight with their lances, and then this kind of becomes this sports spectacle, and you're supposed to look good with all your and they some of the pictures I showed of the Alba, they actually kind of date to this relate to this time when in the tournament culture it's all about looking good, and you wear these crazy costumes and have these armors that when they are hit they actually spring up and explode and all this weird stuff. If you saw that in a film you would say that's not historical, so this is something that happens at that time. And then of course when the relevance of this heavy cavalry charge becomes it's not anymore a tool of war, then it's just something that the nobility does. And the same thing you could say that with fencing happens around the same time. Then when the sword becomes like this, you have a small sword which is actually part of your attire. It's not really a weapon. It's not like you're walking around with a assault rifle, but it's something you just have as a nice piece of costume. And then use of that should be so that you don't get sweaty. You can go there, like you don't have to change your clothes, and you can just be nicely do stuff with it. And then if somebody challenges you to a duel, then you can have a go at each other. But it's kind of within this, and in a sense, this in 19th century German students fencing, which is this Mensurfechten, which is done on a fixed measure, so they are not allowed to move their left foot. It's also mainly about. It's not really. It wasn't. Well, they still do it, I suppose. But it wasn't about learning to like fight in a combat, but it's about like standing your ground and looking good and being able to sort of stand there with a razor blade slashing your face and not tilting away from it or anything. And when you see these photographs of these Prussian officers and they've got all these huge scars on their left side, it's always from this. And even that, speaking of Germans, even that book I mentioned from 1935, which was made for a certain youth club in Germany, it also states that fencing is worth nothing unless it looks good. So, yeah.
Yeah, what we remember about swords is that they have pretty much never been just weapons. They have always been also very much status symbols.
Mm-hmm.
Because they have limited use outside this context, and they are quite expensive.
Speaking of looking good, have you paid any attention to what these guys are wearing?
Yeah,
some of the clothes are unbelievably extravagant, and also they're obviously depicted in great detail in the woodcuts too.
Yeah, these are high quality woodcuts, so that's kind of how he lost all this money, having these made.
Do we know who made them, by the way?
It's this. Well, the name escapes me, but yeah, we know the workshop.
And they kind of work together he worked together with Meyer?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question. How these were and illustrations in general, how they are produced, because these are obviously based on the stuff that we can see in his manuscript book, which is of course handmade. But even in the printed book, when he refers to one of these illustrations, he says that the arms are not straight enough. So it's kind of, there is clearly that the artists have made mistakes there, and they might not have made them for nature, in the sense it's not that you can't imagine this scene that 6 people are posing and then you put a dog and then somebody draws from that, but it's kind of like this is a practical way of putting 3 illustrations like in one woodcut, and it kind of looks nice, but they don't really form any sort of memory palace actually, or I mean that was something I was thinking of earlier, but can't see any system there. And he's using them kind of as something that he just now happens to have. So, okay, I have these illustrations and this will go here. And then he mentions them in the text, like the picture printed on the left. And this is depicted in the picture with the letter G, the guy's on the right or something like this. So he has these pictures made and then he uses them. It's kind of like, it's not like nowadays you would know exactly what pictures you need and then you take the pictures and put them there. But he's sort of making use of what he has. And this is very typical that these illustrations are kind of multiplied. As with all woodcuts, people copy them and use them again. And like here, of course, these 2 printings, these the same physical objects used, but this is a copy. And that's also a copy. And this is a copy from the one before, but it's traced and remade. So it's not like a photostatic facsimile or anything. Yeah, this is
interesting. So like part of the confusion comes from the fact that the pictures are not a complete match to the text what he wanted to
and
say.
If you look at, well, actually, if I take, it's a bit blurred, but you can see that his hand is palm facing us, and this guy has his palm facing that way. And in the next one, that's a left arm, left hand. So should be the right. So all these weird things going on here, and also the if you can see, not sure, but how the swords cross here is different from how they cross here. And the text doesn't really help, not sure. But yeah. So this is very typical that there is something wrong with the illustrations and the associated captions.
Further comments or questions?
Maybe. Can you recommend any like modern fencing books called like a hobbyist of fencing? Or like that they're tracing.
Modern or what? I probably can't, but do you mean like primary sources or? Yeah. In original language or translation?
Translation.
Well, Jeffrey Faulkner's translations are beautiful. I mean, just get them all. Yeah.
I have continuation to that because I was looking for histories of fencing, and the only one that I found was an English one written in the
Castles.
Yeah, no.
Edgerton Castle.
Yes, that.
Yeah.
And I didn't find anything more modern.
There is one by names just escape me when I'm tired. There is one, but they are not usually that good when it comes to early 17th century. Because like I said, Camillo Agrippa, he is the beginning of modern fencing, and then Ridolfo Capoferro, he's the first one to describe the lunge, and that's only when you can talk about real fencing, when you have 1, 2, 3, 4, and the lunge. So it's kind of everything else is. This was even called this era of where Maya belongs. It's called by a certain Viennese fencing historian in his very little thin booklet as the era of bizarre guards, because they have all these Nebenhut, Unterhut, Zornhut, and so forth. So it's kind of like taken as something of a curiosity or a joke. And if memory serves, Edgerton Castle actually says that Maya's rapier is just a ripoff of Giacomo di Grassi's, which I don't think is the case. And he talks about Antonio Mangiolino and says some really weird things about him, which obviously betray the fact that he has never seen the book. And Jacopo Gelli, the Italian fencing historian, then kind of ridicules him for this in 1906. But yeah, so there is conflict in fencing literature as well. This is like an ongoing theme. And Heinrich von Günterode, whom I mentioned, like when he's talking about Maya, this is the conflict theme, that all these idiots writing about this before, but now I know the true principles, because I have seen this medieval book written by monks.
Okay, well, I don't think we have time for any more, unfortunately. It's been a fascinating talk and a fascinating discussion on an extremely interesting topic, and one we're not likely to hear about all that often. So thank you very much for this. It's been very informative.